What's up, witches? I just wanted to come on here and make a confession. I've been on the Skyline talking a lot about hexes, baneful magic, magical activism, and when, predictably some people take a stance that just there's never any excuse for that kind of thing, I can get kind of spicy. And before it comes across as me just being an asshole to people who, don't want to do heavier working in their path, I wanted to make a confession. I am so spicy and so passionate because for the first 10 to 15 years of my practice, I was one of those people who was terrified of harder works. And it was sort of like two things. One, I was in a privileged position where that kind of thing was something I didn't have to think about in my own life and in the management of my own life. And two, I had a lot of religious trauma that I needed to do the shadow work and processing around before I could really approach those kinds of magics in the right headspace. I think one of the main reasons a lot of people shy away from heavy work is because they feel that it's just sort of like a petty thing that we should be above. You shouldn't want to hex your ex or get that mean coworker fired. That's just petty. Well, it can be, sure. And everything that is used by humans is going to be used inappropriately by some humans. That's just life. But before you completely write off those kinds of workings, you need to think about the historical context that these things developed in. It's only very recently in history that women in so many parts of the world have so much freedom. It wasn't until like the 1980s in America that a woman could have her own credit card. So this put a lot of people and a lot of women in this circumstance in a position of powerlessness, and they needed a way to take their power back in a system that gave them nothing to work with. Same sort of thing goes for hexing your boss or getting rid of gossipy coworkers, getting people to shut up who are talking behind your back at work. Seems really petty on the face of it, but I mean, just think about even in the United States today and like right to work states. And then historically, where, you were like vassals and serfs and servants and slaves, right? Your livelihood, your life could be cut off so easily in these systems where people were kept down and oppressed, and they needed to find a way to take their power back, to keep them and their loved ones safe. Sometimes magic is the only way to do that. And then, of course, there are those big, bad, unaliving spells. Those are a bit extreme, don't you think? Are they? Are they? We all know of situations where someone was in a life-threateningly abusive situation, where they really didn't have an out, where they had children who were being put in danger every day. What are they going to do when the authorities don't give a shit? And sometimes those life-threateningly abusive relationships are not romantic or intimate ones. They're an authority figure that has complete power over you. You got SWAT. The only way out is to get rid of the person that wants to you, right? It's or be, and magic can fill that role. Now, if you've never really thought about hexes and curses and those kinds of contexts before, well, congratulations. Your life is pretty great. I'm not saying it doesn't have problems, but if you've never been in a situation where you felt so powerless and so helpless that there was no way for you to get aid and support other than turning to esoteric or mystical spiritual forces, that's a fucking privilege, you know? There are people to this day around the world who have never lived one day of their life without having to deal with extremely severe, life impinging oppression. They exist. They've always existed. They still exist. They could be you tomorrow. So it's better to know a bit about all of this than to stick your head in the sand about it. And here's where I'm going to say something that's a little harsh, a little controversial. If you identify as a witch or you are studying witchcraft with an intent to practice, and the very idea of curses and hexes is so offensive and troubling to you that you cannot even like take in information about them. I'm not saying you have to do them. I'm just saying knowing the information that exists about it, which is a very large component of the path you are studying. If that is so troublesome for you, I'm going to go so far as to say that witchcraft is not for you. There are other spiritual paths that you can be on, 100%. But if you're going to be involved with witchcraft, you need to understand that part of the craft and why it exists. Now, all that being said, I don't think that every single person that's doing folk magic and witchcraft needs to run around doing curses all the time. That's not the case. Some people, it's not in their skill set, really. Other people, they're definitely not ready for it. They have a lot of things they need to learn and go through before they are going to be ready to do it. And in most cases, I think, honestly, curses and hexes should be something of a last resort, a means of self defense, right? Where you've tried everything else and now you just find yourself in a situation where you're going to have to duke it out. Nobody wants to be in those situations, but they can happen. And sometimes finding yourself in that situation ends up initiating you into other forms of magic. But it's not something that I feel is mandatory to practice. But if you're going to be in this world, you have to at least be educated in why it's there and not automatically looking down your nose at anyone who does practice them. So, to bring it back around to my confession, for a very long time, I was one of those people who was not ready to be doing hexing work. And the main reason around that is I had a lot of religious trauma that I still had to work through. Like a lot of people, I come from a evangelical Pentecostal home. I was surrounded by prayer warrior culture, right? Where I would watch these people get together and like pray disease, destruction, hardship, sometimes death against people for, the crime of not wanting to go to their church, or for having cut them off at the grocery store, or for having not wanting to be prayed over, in the middle of the mall. Really ridiculous, petty, evil shit, honestly. And so I had a very bad taste in my mouth about those kinds of works. I wasn't thinking of it in a larger context. I was stuck in the, tunnel vision that my trauma had given me around who are the kinds of people that do these kinds of works and the reason why they're doing them. So, as shameful as it is, until I was directly faced with systemic issues myself, I was pretty ignorant to how incredibly insidious and deeply woven into the very fabric of society a lot of these systemic oppressions are, and those to ripple out into personal interrelationships as well, because people are socialized within these structures that are oppressive. And so it took me, as a chronically ill woman facing medical gaslighting, with coming up against abusive partners and not having much help, of being estranged from my whole family and not having a safety net, before I really started to see that there were situations that I was quite powerless within, and I needed a way to bring some kind of justice and balance into my life again. But even once I kind of grokked the systemic contexts that baneful magics, stem from and are needed within, I still had to do a shit ton of shadow work around my own fears about that kind of thing before I was able to step into my power and start working with them in, a meaningful way. I had to deconstruct my own judgments about the people I had seen doing that work and realize that those are not the only kind of people doing the work. And that was watching it done badly. And so I needed to honestly find new role models to look at and, have an example of how things can be done right before I was able to start shedding a lot of the, judgments and fear that I had around. Another big thing that I had to work through were my own fears around what it would mean for me and my spiritual development if I started doing harder works. Because ironically, spiritual gifts do run in my family, and one of the strongest ones that we have is for baneful work. As soon as someone in my family starts doing that kind of thing, and granted, I saw it mostly in a prayer warrior context, but as soon as they got into that, they were very good at it, and they kind of became addicted to it, and it just cultivated the worst parts of their personality, and they became even worse people than they had been before. And I was worried that that was just kind of the path that one ended up on if you started doing those magics. Again, I needed proper role modeling and better information to see that that's not actually the case at all. That is the result of extremely imbalanced work. Even if you don't have a very spiritually active family, I understand how people still develop that kind of outlook on baneful work, from being on social media, because as we know, unfortunately, the thing that gets the most clicks is usually the most inflammatory. So people that get out on the timeline and they're really loud and abrasive, and they're throwing hexes every day, at every little thing, and then you see all the people in their comments who are talking about like all their little petty grievances, and it is a very toxic thing that can happen. People do get addicted to it, right? But that doesn't mean that it's in and of itself like a horrible thing that everyone should avoid. I mean, we all know that a substance can heal and that same substance can kill you. It just depends on the dose and how it's used. Magic is no different. So, to sum up, it's okay if you're not comfortable with hexing and you don't want to do them right now or ever. It's not something everyone has to do. That's why we have like village witches, right? Because they serve a community purpose. They provide a service for people who either don't have the skills, don't have the space to practice this themselves, or don't have the energy because the nuts and bolts of just surviving day to day have them absolutely drained. But to take some kind of broad opinion that anyone that engages in baneful magic is necessarily bad, or to not even want to like educate yourself on what it is and how it's practiced because you think that that's somehow going to dirty you, that's extremely dishonest and frankly kind of appropriative if you're claiming to be a witch and practicing witchcraft and you want to completely deny and sanitize and sweep away a huge portion of the craft that is a very large part of its history. Ultimately, hexing and baneful work should be about rebalancing the scales of justice, energy. And if the very idea of that is so viscerally uncomfortable for you, well, for one thing, you should really do some shadow work and introspection about why that idea is so troubling to you. And, if after doing that you still find it really uncomfortable and distasteful, well, then I mean, maybe witchcraft isn't the path for you. And I say that kindly and in all earnesty, but if that is just something you cannot deal with, why are you trying to walk a path that was paved in large part with workings and, spirit relationships that were meant to give power back to those who had had it stripped away? Maybe there's somewhere else for you to be that would resonate for you more. And that's okay. But stop trying to make witchcraft fit into the little box that you've built with your own fears.